There are things a man says only once in his life. Not on a stage, not into a microphone, not with a crowd pressing forward, hungry for him to become something larger than himself. Only once, in a quiet room, when the performance is finally over and the silence has nowhere left to hide. Paris, spring of 1971. Jim Morrison had been living in the city for several months, and the version of him that arrived on French soil was not the version the world had spent years constructing. The leather, the incantations, the chaos that seemed to follow him like weather, all of that had quieted to something lower, something harder to categorize. He was 27 years old. He looked, by most accounts, older than that. Not broken but worn in the way that certain objects are worn, the way a page looks when it has been folded and unfolded too many times along the same crease. He had come to Paris with the intention of writing, poetry mostly. The kind he had always written in private, not the verses that found their way into song, but the ones he kept closer, the ones that did not need music beneath them to carry their weight. Friends described him during those months as calmer, quieter. There was an apartment on the Rue Beautreillis. There was coffee and rain, and the particular anonymity that Paris extends to people who arrive with a history they are trying to set down for a while. It was in this context, not during a press tour, not at a label's request, that a French journalist came to speak with him. His name was not famous. He was young, working for a small publication that covered music and culture with the kind of serious intention that characterized a certain strain of French journalism in that era. He had requested the interview through intermediaries, and Morrison, perhaps because there was no commercial reason attached to it, perhaps because the man seemed genuinely curious rather than hungry for a headline, agreed. They met in the late afternoon. The light in Paris at that hour in spring falls at a low angle and turns everything it touches the color of old paper. Morrison was unhurried. He had been reading. There was a glass of wine on the table and a notebook nearby, though its pages were closed. The journalist, who would later describe the encounter in a personal letter that only surfaced decades later, noted that Morrison seemed almost reluctant to perform not in the theatrical sense, but in the conversational one. He spoke without the careful architecture that public figures usually erect around their words. They talked for a long time about the Doors, though not in the way interviewers in America tended to talk about the Doors, not about chart positions or concert incidents, or the famous controversies that had followed the band through the late 60s like uninvited guests. They talked about what music is supposed to do, about whether a song can ever fully carry what the songwriter put into it, or whether something always falls away in the translation from internal experience to external sound. Morrison spoke about Los Angeles with a distance that was neither sentimental nor bitter. He spoke about his father in a way he rarely did in public, not with anger, not with the mythologized estrangement that had become part of his official story, but with something more complicated, something closer to grief. And then, toward the end of the conversation, the journalist asked him a question. The exact phrasing has been reported differently in the years since, but the substance of it was this. What did Morrison believe his music had given people, and what, if anything, did he feel it had taken from him in return? He was quiet for a moment. The journalist remembered looking down at his notes, assuming Morrison was gathering his thoughts in the way that articulate people sometimes pause before a complicated answer. But when he looked up again, Morrison was not gathering his thoughts. He was looking out the window. The street below was ordinary. Someone walking a dog. A delivery truck. The specific irrelevance of a city going about its afternoon, while one of its temporary residents sat at a window above it, holding a question like a weight he had not been prepared to lift. Then he spoke. What he said, that single sentence, was this: that the music had given millions of people a place to feel less alone, and that making it had left him more alone than anything else he had ever done. He said it simply, without drama, as though it were a fact he had known for a long time, and was only now saying out loud to another human being. The journalist wrote it down. He understood immediately that it was the most honest thing he had heard in years of interviews. Perhaps the most honest thing he would ever hear. He also understood, sitting in that room with the fading light and the closed notebook, and the man across the table who had just said something true enough to hurt, that publishing it would do something irreversible. It would take a private admission spoken, without performance, without the protective distance of metaphor, and hand it to the world that Morrison had spent a decade both courting and fleeing. He chose not to publish it. The journalist kept his notes. He kept the memory. He wrote about the afternoon in a personal letter to a friend, sometime in the mid-1970s, and it was that letter, passed through several hands over the following decades, that eventually brought the account to light. By then, Morrison had been dead for years. The sentence had traveled a long, quiet road to reach the people who would read it. What is remarkable about it, and what has lingered in the minds of those who encountered the story, is not its sadness, though it is sad. It is the precision of it, the way it contains, in two equal halves, the entire contradiction at the center of Morrison's life and work. He understood what the music did for others. He understood what it cost him personally. And he held both of those things at the same time, without softening either one, without resolving the tension between them into something more comfortable. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs specifically to people whose work connects deeply with others. It is not the loneliness of being unseen. It is the loneliness of being seen only as the thing you made, and never quite as the person who made it. The song travels outward and becomes communal. It belongs to everyone who has ever heard it in a car on a long road, or in a room where someone they loved had just left, or at the particular hour of night when a human being is most aware of their own smallness. The song becomes theirs, and the songwriter sits in an apartment in Paris, watching a delivery truck move down an ordinary street, carrying something the world will never fully return. Morrison did not spend that afternoon asking for sympathy. He was not performing vulnerability, the way public figures sometimes perform it, when they sense an audience wants to feel closer to them. He was simply saying what was true. And what was true was that the distance between what his music created for others and what it cost him internally was wider than anyone, standing in a stadium, singing his words back to him, could have known. The journalist left the apartment as the evening came in. Morrison walked him to the door. They shook hands. Morrison went back inside, back to the notebook on the table, back to the poems that had no music under them yet, and might never need any. A few months later, in July of that year, he was gone. The sentence he spoke that afternoon has never been widely quoted, never carried the viral weight of the phrases that appear on posters and memorial walls. It exists at the edge of the record, acknowledged by those who traced the letter, considered carefully by those who understand the difference between what an artist performs and what an artist privately knows. But it remains, in its quiet way, perhaps the most complete thing he ever said about his own life. Not a lyric, not a poem, just a man, in a room, in Paris, in the last season of his life, telling the truth to someone who was willing to protect it. The music gave millions of people a place to feel less alone. Making it had left him more alone than anything else he had ever done. That was the whole story, and almost no one heard it.